Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is British man, or Englishman, Josh Ferme. He is a presenter at thelotuseaters.com and a writer at Courage Media. He's a psychologist, and in this conversation we talk about the British identity, where it derives from, and what it needs to do to fight back against the globalist, universalist forces that would tear Britain apart, flood it with non-British people, and then futz around with the identity so that it doesn't really mean anything in and of itself. Josh has a big heart and a studious mind, and I really appreciated discussing these topics with him. You can find links to his work down there in the description. He's got his own YouTube channel too, which you certainly must check out. Without further ado, here is Josh Ferme. What's your entry point to commentator sphere?
I was in academia, so I was doing a master's dissertation basically the day before I applied. I finished it off the day before I wrote out an email to apply for Lotus Eaters, and I got hired as a writer just because even in academia my writing was relatively good, and so
even in academia,
as in it doesn't necessarily translate very well, and also I was working in the sciences, so it's not necessarily particularly engaging writing, is it?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there are masters of the field, the subgenre of scientific writing, that can actually like break the blood populist barrier, or the brain populist barrier, rather.
I might move back a little bit because my chair is squeaking if I move. That hasn't cut the microphone off, has it, at all?
No, you're good. You're good.
Perfect. Okay. So, what were you thinking about talking about?
Figuring out where the next question is from you applying to Lotus Eaters and bringing your psychological expertise. Is that what it is? What was your master's in, and what specifically?
Yeah, it was psychological research methodology. So I was like a research-focused psychologist, but that actually is quite useful because it means I can do medicine and like political research, and it's basically the same methodology, just applied to different fields, but it's basically universal. It's just statistics and maths, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just talking to a board game designer, specifically war games, which is a subset of board games. And they've been around for a while. And this guy he's total history buff. He just dropped towards the end of the conversation that statistics actually comes from the state studies. And it was a Prussian dictator or king or emperor or whatever they called themselves at the top of the Prussian hierarchy that really wanted to understand exactly how many peasants he had, how many nobles he had. And so the study of broad level human, I guess, categories comes from the state, from Prussia.
I had no idea. Wow. There we go. I've already learned something. We've not even got started yet.
Oh, we've started.
Oh, we have we?
We're here, Joshua. You're in the conversation. You're in the converse. But what drew you to, I guess, research focus? I'm sure that you kind of have to have chops. So you're probably adept at that way of thinking. That probably what facilitated you getting into it. But what about your interest?
So my basic thinking was, because I was originally planning to go into studying joint honours history and politics, because both of those things interested me already. But as I was going through my studies before university, I realised that the fundamental thing that we have to understand before we develop a sort of complete understanding of those subjects is human beings ourselves. And I realised that the real poverty in society was in our understanding of psychology, and I saw it as more of a calling to go into that than it was elsewhere. And of course, in the end, I proved that wrong because I went straight back into politics as soon as I finished my education. But the basic thinking is that, well, how can we restructure the world when we don't even understand ourselves? You want a society that structures things in a way in which accounts for human nature. And I still think in those terms very much so. I think also sort of my scientific education shapes how I look at politics. I'm much more data and evidence based than I could be, as well as the fact that I think it allows you to talk about things and put them in a way that sounds very measured and doesn't sound too extreme, even though what you might be asserting is. And so I think that's quite a useful rhetorical tool when you're trying to push the boundaries of acceptable discourse, knowing how you can use language to frame it in a way that it sounds so uncontroversial that people would be like, of course. So I've got people to agree to things that if I framed it in the way that many people do politically, it would sound terrible, but you frame it in the right way, and people are very responsive to it. And it's just about making people realize that you're looking at it from an analytical perspective rather than an emotional one. When I look at things like race and crime statistics, if I report it in a dispassionate way, just looking at the data and analysing it and not saying anything else about it, people are much more willing to accept it at face value. And so it's certainly got its uses, as well as the fact that, of course, I think everyone should have a good understanding of human nature. And I think that it's quite woeful in the year of our Lord, 2025.
The state of people's understanding of this thing that you call human nature is woeful?
I would say so. Obviously, the amount of understanding is very varied. There are some people who have a very good grasp of it, and there are some people who don't. But I saw something the other day. Someone responded to me saying, human nature is a product of culture and historical circumstances, or something like that, rather than it being deeply encoded biological. And I mean, none of this stuff is a mystery. We know the brain areas involved. We know roughly when these sort of developed and things like that. So we've got a much more complete picture than people might give it credit for, I suppose.
So if you have these different cultures with different histories and different behaviors of the populace within those cultures and histories, how do you determine what might be the best culture and how that culture could be universally applied? Let's just say the project of liberalism in its various different manifestations has tended towards the universal. And currently, from the American point of view, our way is best, and everybody else is this thing called illiberal, and somehow tyrannical, or they miss the mark, or wrong, or even evil, up to and including evil. But how do we square like this liberal society with more or less free trade, more or less free speech, more or less freedom of association, more or less, with cultures that don't accept that? And then how do we square that with the fact that we don't have those freedoms in practice?
Of course, there's obviously a lot to get into there, but I think that certain kinds of people from certain places, there's an interplay between the people and the land. The land shapes the people first and foremost, and then the people shape the land. And there's this feedback between the two. And then over hundreds and thousands of generations, it seems to shape the character of a people where they live. And for example, like Britain is, generally speaking, quite a safe place. We don't really have many natural disasters or dangerous animals, and the ones we did have, we hunted out of extinction. And I think it's made people very complacent and comfortable. I think of us, and of course this was the inspiration for it, as the hobbits in the Shire in the Lord of the Rings. I believe they were based on an area just outside of Birmingham in the countryside. But it's this sort of very peaceful way of life, whereas I can imagine, although I'm not part of that ancestry, and I've never been there, but places that are quite barren and deserty are going to have a very different atmosphere just by the environment itself. And I think that this shapes how people behave. And there's this tendency to suggest that human beings don't change that much. Once we are human beings, then we're sort of very static. And I think there are slow and gradual changes over time, and these can compound, particularly when there are more stresses on a population. And if you've had to adapt to somewhere that's very hostile, well, it makes sense that you're more conscious of danger, and that shapes how you view society. And so I think if you have to look at which system is best, you've got to look at where it is in the world and how it works for the people that live there, as well as the fact that I think that my own sort of personal bias and experiences suggest that a place that has known civilization for longer tends to be better. And so, for example, of my opinion of the Middle Eastern countries, of all my experience of people from that part of the world, I find that people from Persia or Iran, because it's a very old part of the world, they're a very old people, they tend to be a bit wiser and a bit more savvy and world weary, I suppose, than newer countries. And that's not to say that, they're any more right, but it's a disposition that I think lends you towards creating societies that are more long-lasting and more stable. And of course, that's a general trend. You can't necessarily say that about modern Iran, but
or Egypt. I mean, no knock on Egypt, but they're not. I don't know anything about Egypt. I just don't imagine them to be the most, the beacon on the hill, the shining city on the hill at present, even though they have such a long lineage of civilization.
I think that I'm no expert on this, so this is just some things I've read that I found interesting. I'm pretty sure that there's been some sort of demographic change in Egypt, and it used to be a different people in ancient times, or at least somewhat genetically different than they are today. And of course, there's an inevitable amount of change over time, but I think that there were migrations of peoples from surrounding areas and the like that has changed the nature of the country. And I think also, they've changed religion, right? And that's going to have a massive effect on their culture and their country.
Yeah. So if, let's say, liberals who prize, and I'm among them, in my assumptions and in my how I was educated and indoctrinated to perceive liberalism as the end of history, so-called, we deeply despise difference across race lines. We don't like noticing it, and you're allowed to notice it a little bit, but it's not polite. You really have to stuff those thoughts away if you want to engage in polite society. But if genetics do exert a significant pressure on socialization, then importing a bunch of people into the same land is going to shake out into some measure of segregation just so that these different genetic clades can get along. Now, there's always going to be margins, and liberals like to are you from the individual and are you from the margins? But on group levels, there's going to be group level conflict. And if you don't like segregation, you probably want to avoid, you probably want to just rely on space and time to segregate people rather than compacting everybody into these small areas. And then, I guess, assuming that given the proper incentive structures, they'll all have the same level of competence in any given activity that produces a better society.
I very much agree. And actually, you've reminded me of something that I find interesting, and I wonder what you might think of it, that obviously, Britain and America are very liberal countries, so to speak. Perhaps that's changing, who knows? But we're countries that are most associated with it to a certain extent, other than maybe France. And one thing that I found interesting is the difference between the United States and Britain, because the United States is effectively its own continent, really, isn't it? It's huge. You've got all sorts of different kinds of geographies and peoples. And you don't necessarily have to leave the United States if you don't want to. Many people don't. And, credit to you. If I had all that on my doorstep, I'd go abroad far less as well. But one thing that I think has changed in Britain is, or is different in Britain, should I say, is that because we've got so many different cultures on our doorstep in Europe, which is sort of our equivalent of America, if you will, with different languages and different ways of being to a certain extent, although there's obviously considerable overlap. I think we're more willing to admit that people are different and not just the same. And there's no fault of America or Americans more generally. You know, if we were the people in the United States, and obviously many Americans are from Britain, we would think the same thing. It's just by merit of chance that we're here and not there. And I think that in the United States, where you've got this basically continent to yourselves, it's easier to push a universalist view of the world because people are a bit more similar. You know, all of the states, well, less so maybe in recent years, most people speak English. Obviously, there's a pretty strong minority that speaks Spanish as well, and lots of other languages these days. Whereas in Europe, we don't. And I think that this shapes our view of universalism as a bit more nuanced in Europe because we know there's difference because it's on our doorstep. And of course, in the United States, even though you do have, you know, people who are fresh from Mexico who aren't exactly American, you still have more Americans around and you've got a broader area to go to. And I think it makes it easier to agree to this universalist idea because of the land itself.
Well, the land, and I would just add to that, aside from, we have regional fast food restaurants, but we have so many like Walmart is the same, almost the same across America, Costco, McDonald's. We have these places where we eat and we shop that are replicated over and over again. And so there's just this kind of familiarity wherever you go. And there are degrees of difference, but there's always like these familiar pockets. So I think that this kind of works on a subconscious level, that universalism is just, you know, standardization is very possible and actually productive, and probably the way to gain the most profit and the most power is to standardize something.
No, I think it's one of the things that has been in the United States' favour is that there are fewer barriers to cooperate within the United States, and the European equivalent is harder because we speak lots of different languages, although I recently was in the south of France and most people spoke English, and learning French in school, it being the neighbouring country across the English Channel, I knew enough that I could get by, but it's much harder, and it is also, because of that difference, there are more differences in how things go about. There's a sort of uncanny valley feeling I felt where things were similar to what I knew, but it was sort of in that area where they're different enough that I was just like, I feel a little bit uncomfortable with this, but it's okay. Mm-hmm. But I think that people do need to start thinking in these sorts of ways of just introspecting, because a lot of politics we think about outwards and, geopolitics and the like. And I think that we're living in an age in the West where we've got to turn inwards and think about our presumptions about how we look at the world, how we believe what we do and why we believe what we do and things like that. And I think it's very important, and it's already going on to a certain extent already, and I think that's great. But that's sort of what I was trying to get at here.
Yeah, one persistent question when I speak with British people about their politic and their current moment is what makes a British person a British person? What does it mean to be English? I think post World War II
conversation.
From what I've gathered since World War II, you guys have lost a lot of your own identity, and that's becoming a crisis, because now you have stronger and stronger alien identities or foreign identities that are at your doorstep, and not just across the channel, but across the hallway from you. Mm-hmm. So the tools that you bring to bear, population levels and personal level statistics and psychology, might help to craft the way in which one can start to talk about identity in a late stage liberal world.
Sure. my sort of view of it is just to clear up, because this is very confusing, even for British people. We get it wrong ourselves quite often. So the United Kingdom includes England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Britain is the island, so it is obviously you've got the British Isles that includes Ireland itself, but also when we use the word Britain, it means England, Wales, and Scotland, and it excludes Northern Ireland, which is not, us being mean. It's just
I think that they don't like being called British, from what I gather.
yeah, well, funnily enough, I've got a weird amount of ancestry from there, which surprised me. But
Really?
the way I see it is very different than the way things have been, but it's a more old worldy way of looking at it. So, under the British Empire, everyone in the British Empire was a British subject, and it didn't necessarily discriminate between who's English, who's Scottish, who's from India, who's from Jamaica. These were all our territories, and we were all subjects of the crown. And so that at the time made perfect sense, because it legitimizes your territories, and people don't have a reason to get upset because we'd learnt a little bit of our lessons of not making people want to associate with us, former colonies and the like. And I think that this was to address that sort of thing. And generally speaking, although there were differences in how our provinces were governed, there wasn't that much movement between the countries, other than, our administrators and the like. And this worked for a while, but then post-World War II, and particularly with the invention of cheap air travel, all of a sudden we get mass migration, and this way of operating hasn't changed. Beforehand, people understood England is the land of the English people, Wales is the land of the Welsh, Scotland is the land of the Scots, and these are distinct peoples. That's why we have our own nations under the banner of Britain. They're also provably genetically distinct as well. Scots don't have very much Anglo-Saxon DNA, whereas the English, that's perhaps a third or even, more than that sometimes, depending on where you are in the country. And this didn't have to be said because everyone understood it. A Scotsman was different than an Englishman, even though you were both British. You look different, you have different cultures. But as we had to legitimize, and I say we, I mean the state, had to legitimize the new arrivals, they said, well, they're British because it existed, this notion of a British subject. However, in so doing, what they'd done is destroy the informal understanding that people had. And so even now, people of the right in Britain will say that, well, they can't necessarily be English, Scottish, or Welsh, ethnically speaking, but they can be British. And I push back on this because I'd say, well, it's only because of the legal approach or the constitutional approach that we had that allows this to be the case, and people understood it differently in the past, and it just simply hasn't been updated because no one's really been thinking about it, or it's even been maliciously overlooked to justify this mass movement of people. And I think that although people have competing ideas about it, the trend is towards saying, no, actually, being British is still an ethnicity. You're just one of the three groups of either Scottish, Welsh, or English. Mm-hmm. And it's just a catch-all term in the same way you might say, I don't know, like Italian, because North Italy and South Italy are quite distinct. There's more Greek influences in the South than the North. Mm-hmm. And but we still understand what Italy means. But you can still make the distinctions between different peoples.
Yeah. The operative word when you're describing what it means to be British was that there are British subjects to the crown. So there is one unifying power that articulates all these differences. Once that crown is delegitimized or its meaning deflated in the very least, and I don't know what keeps these identities distinct. And what I see or I perceive the elites in Britain now subject to is a globalist globalist aesthetic. There's no crown. There's a bunch of treaties and basically a bunch of treaties and then money changers. That is the power that lords over Britain or keeps Britain in power insofar as Britain still is in power. So how does the market, how does treaties form people and then allow them to be different from one person to the other, and then to honor, or not just to honor the difference, but to actually prioritize or hierarchize those differences? One would assume that if your ancestors were from England, the English government or the elites would care more about you than somebody born in Pakistan. But that's not the case. Actually, it's the opposite, for whatever reason. So it doesn't even make sense. So there, whatever kept people British, that crown and that subject, that's removed. So there's got to be something else there. You have to identify what is there, what is in that power gap, and then that will explain why treatment is. And there's this two-tiered policing reality from what I've seen, and maybe you could argue against that or bring more nuance to it. But it seems like that the white British are their speech is policed, whereas the foreigners, their behavior is not policed or is accepted. That is antithetical to British values.
The way I see things is that most of modern politics is about resource extraction, and I think that our politics is decided in a similar way to most Western countries by very wealthy people and transnational corporations dictating the acceptable bounds for politicians to venture in. And of course, they're the ones that are donating to them. They're the ones that make or break their careers. And so that has taken the place of the crown. Money is sort of now king, and we're going in more of a direction that perhaps the United States has of money is status in and of itself, whereas of course this is a little bit of stating the obvious. We had the class system in Britain whereby it wasn't necessarily how much money you had, it was your social class. And actually this still exists to a certain extent in the sense of people judge you more by how you carry yourself than how wealthy you are, which I actually think is quite good and healthy. And obviously that's not to say that that's not done in America either, but just perhaps that it might be a little bit more widespread here. But what is going on here is that particularly the English identity is being suppressed because English nationalism is very different from, say, Welsh or Scottish nationalism. So Welsh and Scottish nationalists tend to be left-wing, and they'll welcome in immigration and the like. And this is good for these transnational corporations and elites because it means there's lots of cheap capital, human capital flooding in, and that pushes down wages so they don't have to pay their employees as much, and it increases demand, and so they win on both accounts, as well as there's another part to it whereby by crushing the middle classes, preventing them from potentially being successful and rising up and actually having a true meritocracy, they're eliminating their competition. So they're maximizing their profits in 3 different directions there. And what I see, and what is self-evident over the past 30 or so years, is you can look outside in Britain and you can see that although we've advanced technologically, the country looks poorer than it was. Things used to be nicer and work better, and everything was a little bit more optimistic in the 90s, similar to the US to a certain extent. And we're seeing the hollowing out of wealth, and not to sound too left-wing here, but there is growing inequality, and it is a problem. And I think it's because the money men decide what are acceptable politics, and they don't want to upset this nice little scheme that they've got going where they can treat us like cattle and milk us of all of our wealth by suppressing our wages and making the cost of living increasingly expensive. And I think there's an excellent demonstration of this by the fact that the COVID lockdowns obviously very destructive economically. I don't think anyone denies that. We shut down the economy, and many economies worldwide. And that period of time was the largest transfer of wealth to elites in global history. Well, if they're making that much money in a time of tragedy, who knows what else they might do to us to have this sudden increase in wealth generation.
Yeah. What is, if they dictate the terms of engagement, what is the possibility of resistance, and what is the path toward reestablishing England for the English?
Well, there's one very hard boundary, and it's that they don't want to push it too far, because if you push things too far, then you get towards the societal collapse and economic failure, and we become like somewhere like South Africa that once had developed infrastructure and no longer has it, because how do I put this? It has been run poorly in recent years, and things haven't been maintained, and not to a standard that they used to be. And so things have got objectively worse and less economically productive. They don't want that scenario because, well, they'll stand to make less money out of the country. And so there's a very hard boundary of, well, we're not going to allow things to get to that level because that upsets our ability to make money. But perhaps they might, I'm not entirely sure how it's going to be perceived, but perhaps they're going to see that, oh, well, the short-term benefit of having a multicultural mass immigration society, we've got our fill, maybe we can allow them to correct things and make things better. And it's sort of like a raid, if you will. It's only a temporary thing. They come in, take the wealth and leave, and then allow things to generate again and maybe come back and do a similar thing, maybe not identical, but the same sort of playbook where they can extract more wealth from people.
Jeez, that's so stark. When you brought up South Africa, which is in dire straits, at least the Afrikaners have a sense of identity, and South Africa is big enough. I mean, it's named after a continent, and it's kind of a mini continent itself. It's so big. It has the space for independent groups to kind of carve out their own ways of living, but in Britain, you're pretty much stacked on top of each other. I know there's gaps between, one town and another, but and I know there's got to be ethnic or heritage enclaves that are still there, but I don't see the elites allowing for much solidarity, ethnic particularity, accepting the foreigners. They get all the ethnic solidarity that they could possibly want, and more so. But the white heritage British are stamped down and tamped down on. And it seems like they kind of accept that, or they've been lulled into complacency a little bit, to harken back to what you're talking about with the hobbits. So, and I see, or I hear like a little bit of rumbles, you guys had like a flag march, and there were some riots. I'm not advocating violence, but it was an expression of solidarity, and standing up for one's own self underneath an oppressive kind of bully husband of the state. So I'm wondering how you see that shaking out, and just how careful that has to be navigated in order for, England can be for the English from the ground up.
So there are multiple different things to mention here before I get on to how we can actually potentially solve things. So the first thing is that England in particular is, I think, the second most densely populated country in Europe after the Netherlands, which is basically one big urban sprawl. And it's my personal opinion that it would be a lot better in England if there were fewer people. I'm not saying, hurt anyone or anything like that. I'm just saying perhaps there is a greater necessity to deport people because we, as you rightly put it, and I would put it exactly the same way, we are living on top of each other. And to get into a little bit of psychology here, when you're so jam-packed with people, it's such an unnatural environment to be in. Human societies pre-agriculture seem to live in groups of no more than 100 or 150. We knew everyone. We can tell this by how many names and faces the human brain can keep track of, and it's a pretty consistent number across people. And so we can sort of work backwards, even though obviously we weren't there to observe it.
Yeah.
But I think it's Dunbar's number, it's called,
Yeah.
off the top of my head. And also, you're in a busy, loud environment constantly. In fact, the first video I ever made on my channel was talking about how cities are psychologically bad for you. And the main factor here is the density of it. That is basically a powder keg for discontent, in my opinion. And the more urbanization you get, the more people are generally going to be dissatisfied. And you don't need to even, read research studies and the like to understand that people in the countryside are happier than people in cities, generally speaking. And you need some nature around you and things like this. And as this slowly gets consumed by housing developments, and as more and more people get packed into cities, it's going to raise people's overall sense of there's something deeply wrong here. And this isn't even a rational thing. It's deeply embedded in human nature that when there are too many people in one place, we feel very uncomfortable. And, it's not to say that you can't go to a concert and enjoy it, but if you were living in that concert environment constantly, it would be unpleasant. And I think that this stems from the fact that too many people in one place means that there's going to be brutal competition for resources, and it's not sustainable. And this is hard baked into many animals that aren't human beings as well, and it makes perfect sense. But this is why I'm sort of rooting my analysis in it, is that it's something that is so hard baked into us, the fact that it's found in lots of other animals as well, that I don't think it's something that can be changed or overcome. It's an integral part of human nature because it's so integral for us survival that its absence might cause us to die out and then no longer pass on our genes, and that is why this has been so hardly baked into us. So I think that there's only so much of this you can do before people are going to be like, this is awful, I don't want to live like this anymore. And they'll push back, because at the minute 98% of our population growth is through mass migration as well. That was the most recent past years, I think. And so very little of it is organically the native British people. It's all coming from abroad, and also it's from countries like Nigeria and Pakistan and places where they're not necessarily cultures that are compatible with ours, to put it nicely. And so this accelerates that effect. And then you get things like the riots in 2024, I think it was in August, after the murder of those poor young girls by the son of Rwandan refugees. And you see evidence of this build-up of tension, because just like that, the entirety of England was rioting.
Yeah. Well, for how long
Moses,
and what impact did that have? Like true political impact?
So what it did was it didn't necessarily change much, because we've got a Labour government that's hostile to the native population. A bit of a sweeping statement, but I think it's fairly
What was
evidenced.
the Robin Hood, the story of Robin Hood? King Richard's gone, so you got Prince John, is it? In
King
charge?
John, yeah.
Yeah, King John is in charge, yeah.
But what it did was it forced an error by making the Prime Minister Keir Starmer declare war on anyone who was right-wing. And he's just like, and although very few people were actually out rioting, most people stayed at home, and it was a small minority of people, and also the people who were out doing it weren't exactly prime representatives of, they weren't giving detailed political analysis necessarily. Let's just say that. But in drawing these deep lines between people, it's deepened this notion of, well, we're the native British people, and these other people aren't us. And of course, as I was saying earlier, we're already quite conscious of our differences already, living so close to lots of different nations. And we're a little bit more sensitive about this nowadays. When we had the sort of liberal consensus, the Francis Fukuyama end of history thing, as you alluded to earlier, people were complacent and happy, and they didn't really worry about these sorts of things. Now times are hard. They realise, oh wait, if we don't stand up for ourselves, there's going to be trouble. And although these riots didn't really achieve much politically, and if anything, brought a greater crackdown on people, the more the government cracks down on people, the more it radicalizes them. So they've got this impossible bind where if they do nothing, there's no punishment for going against the state and causing chaos. If they punish people, it frustrates them further and they become more radicalized. And so they can't really do anything. And there was recently a Labour Party conference where Keir Starmer basically declared war on the political right. And at the minute, the Reform Party, which is centre-right at best,
Yeah.
is ahead in the polls. It's only at 30%, but the next party is 20%. So this is also quite low. Normally a party's got maybe even 50%. This just shows that there's not much enthusiasm for any party, but they're the ascendant party at the minute. They're the favourites for the 2029 election. And he basically said both their leader and all their supporters are racist. If you care about immigration, you're racist, even though he himself had been trying to move a bit to sort of doing a Tony Blair style thing of pretending to be right wing to try and win the centre ground or some of the right. But the mask is off now. He's just like, yes, if you care about immigration, you're racist. If you're voting Reform, you're racist. That's basically the connotation. He didn't exactly say that. It was a bit more nuanced than that.
Why does anybody care about being racist? What the heck does racism have to do with anything? Post World War II.
Well, I think that
bad words. Were you guys
people are worried about
people in the streets? In anybody's living memory, were there racist laws or race riots?
We've had a few.
Aside from the Black Lives Matter protests that you guys imported from.
Not really. And I mean, we didn't even have proper slavery on the British Isles in the age of the transatlantic slavery. We didn't really have any slaves here. The only time we really did was when I think it was in the 16th century, we had privateers capturing I think it would have been Spanish, not Portuguese, they're our allies, vessels that were transporting slaves. And they're basically pirates, privateer pirates, not much of a difference because we weren't officially at war with them. But they would take these commandeered ships and then just release all of the slaves into Britain. And so we did have a point where they were causing a bit of chaos, but it's going to sound bad now considering what I've just said, but we rounded them up and shipped them back off again.
How is that bad? I mean, isn't that what you guys are agitating for now? Sorry to push the bounds of acceptable discourse. And I know if you say the wrong thing, you're likely to get arrested. So I'm not going to push you too hard.
I'm surprised I've never gotten a knock on the door yet. I've been pushing my luck already. But I was making it sound too much like I'm suggesting we round up all the black people and ship everyone off. I wasn't necessarily suggesting that. It was a historic point.
Yeah, but I'm just saying allegations of racism, why do they hold water?
Because I think
British people you guys ended slavery. Or you led the push to end slavery. Your notion of the British subject erased race. You guys, went and colonized India, but then after post-colonialism, you guys established a freedom of identity between. So racism shouldn't have leverage like it does. It really shouldn't. That is another American mind worm that your elites have imported to suppress your own speech and psychology.
That's true. I think it still has some degree of power, but far less than it used to. Like, it's interesting to me how many people are just like, yeah, I guess I'm racist now. As in, by the definitions of the elites, not like going out, putting on their pillowcase and chasing people off or the like. It's just, yeah, I support people being deported. which is now called racist. But people were scared, not necessarily by the accusation in and of itself, but I think it's the second order effects of losing their job, you know, having people that they're friends with disassociate with them, maybe even their family. And these days, people are far less bothered by it. And in fact, you know, people say it to me, maybe when I started in 2020, I would have been a bit more bothered by it. But these days, if someone says you're racist, I'm like, oh, thanks. Just take it as a compliment. Just, you know, it only has power over you if you allow it to. And it's just a word. And I think there are many, I think, to be honest, there are many worse things that you can do in life than be a bit prejudiced to people. I think everyone is to some degree, not to sound too much like Black Lives Matter here. Everyone has a preference for people that are similar to them. We can even see that in psychological research where people prefer faces that resemble their own because it's a proximate marker for genetic relatedness. That's an immutable aspect of human nature. You can't change that. And we shouldn't get too hung up about it, really, because
there's this balance between there's several balances, but one is outgroup antipathy, I guess, is negative racism. In-group preference is another form of racism, but it's actually beneficent racism. And then if you're too in-group focused, you end up marrying your cousin. So you don't want to go that far, right? So there's like this balance, this cultural balance with hazy margins.
I think that people who are too in-group preference, as well as danger of splitting the group as well, because you create a group within the group and things like that. So there is some degree of balance to be struck, but I think that out-group preference is unique basically to white societies, which I find interesting. I do wonder why that is. I haven't found a compelling explanation for this, but there's been multiple different studies that have suggested it's just not a thing outside of Europe and North America, and obviously places like Australia and the like, but the West, more generally speaking, except Japan maybe. So I think they're in the West, aren't they? They sort of count, but they're, you know, they have their own way of thinking about things. I've covered some Japanese politics, and they still have signs just like no foreigners in the shop and things like that. They're very unapologetic. But I sort of respect it. I'd sort of, if I went to Japan and someone was racist to me, I'd be like, oh, sort of like a badge of honor. Just like, I've always wondered what this felt like.
Outgroup preference is there's a lot of different, I think that is what facilitated the Great Wokening, I suppose you cod say, that terminology is fraught. So I have to say, if you want to say wokeness or not, but I think people understand what I mean by that. From 2014 to 2024, that huge wave of white guilt and white antipathy, like open racism towards whites and from whites, by whites, facilitated by whites, in a sadomasochistic manner. One way of explaining it is that you can afford to love other races. That shows just how powerful and confident you are in your social status. It's a form of signaling social status. It's a boutique belief, I think, Rob.
A luxury belief, yeah.
A luxury belief. And it shows, and Yarvin talks about this with a lot of different religions, specifically political religions that think that they're a-religious, is that the more absurd an idea is, the more of a social marker it can be. Like the Trinity doesn't really make sense to a lot of people. Sorry, any Trinitarians out there, my father included. But these really bizarre beliefs signal status because you're beyond the rational in a way. And I think a lot of progressivism has this functional status symbols that are dressed up in a moray or a system of morals that transcend, or that you see them as, this is like cultural suicide that you're committing social hara-kiri or seppuku by claiming that, white people should die out or should be replaced as a white person. Why are you doing this? Like, well, because there's a huge amount of social cachet to take that really extreme position. So there's that level of it and stuff. But we're seeing the tack-on effects or the subsequent effects of that by the elites just absolutely despising and denigrating the population.
I agree with what you're saying there, but I would place a little bit of a different emphasis, if you will. I think that what weak people do is they use morality to ascend a social hierarchy that they couldn't ascend otherwise. And this is something that, to cast it to anecdotes that people might be familiar with, you have very nerdy people that get good grades in school that think they're better than the school jock, to borrow your guys' terms.
You guys don't have jocks?
Well, not to the same degree. I think that there's less of a clear divide. With our education, there's still the same sort of stigma of being a SWAT, as we call it, caring too much about it. But we appreciate the value of education. No one wants to do badly. But, there's still some degree of prestige playing sports, but we sort of see it as secondary to getting a good job and things, because I think it's because we don't get college placements and the like for sports teams necessarily, which is a big incentive in the United States. But
and your martial, there's not a lot of emphasis on the martial kind of values or virtues, because you guys are no longer like a warmongering society. Not even warmongering, but that's no longer an extension of British power and identity, being martial.
I mean, I grew up just on the edge of the city of Plymouth, which is the biggest naval port in Europe, I think. And it's a Royal Navy port, and, they have nuclear submarines and the likes there. And there are a lot of naval people, not only from, our nation, but other countries like the United States would dock there as well. And you don't really notice that much of a difference between them and anyone else. There isn't necessarily the same degree of martial culture because, obviously on the job they're like that, but off of it, they're just normal people. And so I don't think it has the same social influence that it once had. And I don't know how it is in the United States, because the last time I was there, I was 6 years old. And so I probably wasn't looking for these nuanced differences.
Yeah, right.
I think that doesn't have as much of an influence anymore. I forgot what I was actually talking about before.
I totally derailed you, and derailed. You guys have trains, even if they're always late, but so it still holds water. But you said the difference between the nerd and the jock, and
that's right. Yes.
Yeah. Where you're going with that?
Yeah. So the nerdy guy. Not that I'm necessarily being disrespectful. The world needs intelligent people. Uses morality, saying, well, I'm going to contribute more to the world than he will, playing, sports ball, as they might call it. I don't know. That's the modern thing. We didn't have that term in school, but than he will, therefore I should be more important. I've got higher status than he does. When the objective reality is that the person who's more interpersonally charismatic, attractive, and physically in good shape tends to be liked more. And there's this butting of heads between reality and reality as they want to see it, because there's a vested interest. And I think that wokeness stems from a similar impulse of, despite being weak, despite being weird and disgusting, as many of them are, I'm more moral than you, therefore I'm better than you. And it's because they feel their position in society as being much lower than other people. You only need to look at the Antifa mugshots to vindicate this theory, that it's like a human zoo. It's amazing to me as a psychologist, because I'm like, wow, I'd pay good money to speak to some of these people, pick their brains and figure out what makes them tick. But I think that's what's going on in part of it. There's a sort of appeal, but there's also another appeal, because it's one thing to seek status I think lots of people do that. It's not necessarily a politically one-sided thing. But I think the resentment towards oneself, I think that's related to feeling low in the hierarchy as well. But if you're resentful towards yourself, maybe you have a difficult relationship with your parents growing up, not to get too sort of psychoanalytic here, but that ferments resentment to society at large, doesn't it? You know, this is a well-established thing where people who don't have good relationship with their parents, good relationship with their family, and that don't have many friends, are more likely to cause problems. And I think that although it's a very ordinary and slightly boring explanation for it, I think that that's also why they're turning it against their country, is that they're resentful. As Professor Ed Dutton calls it, they're spiteful mutants. I think mutant's a bit of a harsh term. I agree with the sentiment that it's getting at.
Well, in the absence of family and God and king, where do the lower performing, the unattractive, the ugly go? And how do you, outside of that order, which I believe you didn't have a lot of resentment in the Middle Ages. You didn't have a lot of resentment prior to Marxism. There was class tensions for sure, but when you go back and you watch, I'm really sorry to bring up Downton Abbey, but it kind of gives it shows this social hierarchy where you have the effete landlords, and they serve the people who serve them. They act as a unit, but there's absolutely separate social classes. And then there's kind of like intrigue and stuff and pressure and tension between those upstairs and downstairs. But that downstairs had a function and was accepted and respected by the upstairs. And then you also have a unified ideology in religion that equalized everybody before God. And then you have this strong family values that gave everybody a direction from which to gain love and to which to give love on a personal level. And then the state, represented by the king and the aristocracy, made that secular establishment of hierarchy. And outside of that, once you corrode king, God, and family, you're going to have these bubbling, it's going to release a lot of energy, because then the merchant class can go out there and make bank, because they're no longer fettered by, nationalism or a certain level of moral tariffs, right? To prefer their own country to other countries. But without that, then those merchants will then, I think, and I'm kind of going out on a limb here, but there's this cartoon from Occupy Wall Street, which I don't remember what year that was, 2005, 2008, 2010, in the wake of the financial crisis. There was this huge populist uprising against that 1%, like we are the 99%. And there was this cartoon of these bankers like looking out, like we'll have them fight against each other. We'll just kind of drop LGBT and intersectionality in there in order to, one, save our backs, and then have them fight against each other, and then also make tons of money off of their grievances and stuff. So I really do think that in the wake of king, God, and family, where does identity go, and how do you properly shackle the spiteful mutants, so-called, to the public good? There's no longer a public good.
Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, that was very well put. Secondarily, I think that one of the problems that sort of genie that we can't put back in the bottle again is that in the past, people didn't really have that much contact with the world of the super wealthy. Now, the kind of things that very stupid people look at is they sort of venerate material wealth and things like that. And you get people that follow the likes of Andrew Tate, who I'm not a fan of, who think that making money is the be all and end all and things like that, rather than having a family, being grounded and doing good to your fellow man, which I think gives people far more meaning in their life than having a big stack of cash. And I think that this materialism is very useful to foster in people, because it allows these merchant classes to have better workforces that only care about money, and so they're easier to control and motivate. And they'll always chase it thoughtlessly. So that people through the internet are having extravagant wealth they'll never know thrust in their faces, whereas beforehand, the most extravagant thing they would see would be the inside of a church. And I
Yeah.
think that that's a very, very important distinction because
Yeah.
the lower you go down the IQ chart, the more people look at things in a very visual sense rather than metaphysical or moral sense. And so if something is visually good, visually beautiful, it's more important to them than, someone who's a bit more intelligent that knows that, appearances aren't everything.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I'm not sure we can solve.
No, yeah. The older system had humility baked in because there was less opportunity for resentment.
Absolutely. But I think that perhaps one thing that could be done is there needs to be stronger incentives for people to be good to their common man. And the best way you do that is you've got to foster the notion of reciprocity, that people would do the same back to you. And I know that sounds very self-interested and, not necessarily as moral as it could be, but my
Well, you're
way of
just
thinking,
advocating for the golden rule.
basically. However, I think it's got to be implemented in a very specific way. I think that in a multicultural society, there is no golden rule because it's not reciprocated. You've got to have a shared culture to be able to predict the behavior of the person you're being kind to, basically, because then, you think like them and therefore you know roughly how they're going to behave. And so you can encourage people to behave better by having more unity in the society. They perceive themselves as more of a unified group, and therefore they're more willing to work towards common goals and be good to one another. But one thing I would like to stress as well is that, kindness does have its limits as well, in that if someone gives away all of their own wealth to people, sure, it's a marginal benefit to lots of different people, but it's a massive impoverishment to them. And so I would say that you've got to consider yourself in the equation as well. You're still a person that's worthy of respect. And that if you disadvantage yourself too much, then that's bad. And so there is some sort of balance to be struck here of people who are entirely selfless and it's self-destructive, and people who get pleasure in doing good things for other people. And I think that the way you do that is by having, people who will do it as a reciprocity exchange, but as well as the people who are just doing it because it makes them feel good, which is still somewhat self-interested. But these sorts of things can be gently nudged towards.
What is wrong with self-interest?
Well, I'm just talking about it from, I suppose, juxtaposing, self-interest on the one hand with being absolutely altruistic. And I'm saying that neither extreme is good, but we want to narrow it to a window where people aren't actually harming themselves by being too altruistic, but also not harming others by being too selfish. Mm-hmm. And that's just outlining the desirable end goal first, because of course because these sorts of things have disappeared, we have to formalize them before we can bring them back again and sort of articulate what we're looking for. And I think that remigration has to happen for this to come back. It still exists in some parts of England, by the way. Like when I go home and visit my parents where I grew up, people have honesty boxes at the end of their driveways where they've grown fruit and veg, and you've just got an old jam jar where you put your money in, or they'll have a little library, like a little I don't know what to call it, but at the end of the road, and people can borrow books and exchange them, and we have them in old post boxes as well and things like that. It does exist. And so it's ready to spring back into the areas that it's been eradicated from, because there are these sort of live wells of decent culture that still exist. And I'm sounding a bit more optimistic than I probably should, but I think that.
Yeah. No, we just, I had to do some traveling with my stepsons today, and we were listening to the first chapter of Lord of the Rings, The Long Expected Party. And he goes into great detail about the Hobbit culture of sharing and giving gifts on your birthday rather than receiving them, and how that causes everybody to have really cluttered house. And it's really interesting how everybody knows the story, but he very interestedly balances this very generous culture that's filled with very selfish people in a very specific kind of decent selfish. They eat and they drink and they give, but they are always like greedy to get, and so there's that articulation that I do believe is based on a certain British clade. Could you talk about your family? Like, were you once landed and you fell from grace, or were you slaughtering the countryside on a naval vessel and then you just got integrated into the British way of life? How deep does your knowledge of your ancestry go?
It's very deep, actually. My uncle has traced my family history really extensively on my mum's side. Then on my dad's side, he's Scottish. So my mum's English, my dad's Scottish. On my dad's side, it being Scotland, there are clans, and so it's pretty easy to trace things. So I start with my mum's side because it's simpler. So they're all from Devonshire, which is very southwest.
It's got cream, some of the best cream.
That's right, yeah. Well remembered. So as long as you put on the cream before the jam, if you eat scones or scones, however you want to pronounce it.
Scones. I love crumpets. Crumpets with some Devonshire cream and then a little bit of jam.
Mm-hmm. This is one of the misnomers, on a bit of a tangent. We hardly ever eat crumpets. I'm not even a big fan of them personally. Yeah. We all drink tea. That stereotype's true. Also, our teeth aren't as bad as people give us credit for. We just don't get as much cosmetic surgery. But that's all it is. We're a bit more natural about it, which I think is good. But anyway, record corrected. So yeah, my mum's family have lived in Devon, and they've also got some Cornish ancestry, which is a very Celtic part of the southwest. It's on the most southwesterly tip, and I think I've lost much of that because my father's genes seem to override my mother's. And that
You're
part,
dark Irish.
Yeah, it's dark Scots, really. Yeah,
dark Scots. Okay.
I do have some. I think it's about 15% Irish. Republic of Ireland, and then another 15% Northern Ireland, which is more like West Scotland. So the Northern Irish, the Scotties originally went to Scotland, funnily enough, from Ireland, and then they came back again to make Northern Ireland. So there's this interchange, but they're sort of genetically distinct in a way. It's all very complicated, but yeah. So I've got a very sort of Celtic background on my mum's side. I think there might be, depending on which test I take, Ancestry claims I'm 4% French, but if I do living DNA, which is a bit more conservative with these things, it's like 98.8% British with 1.2% Germanic, which is either the Netherlands, Northern Germany, or Southern Denmark, which makes sense. It's just across the way. So I've got that there, quite Celtic, not very much Anglo-Saxon there on that side of the family. It was North Devon, Central Devon, basically Dartmoor, which is a great big barren national park. It was all deforested in the Bronze Age. It's now just grassland, and sort of, you got these beautiful tors, we call them, which is a Celtic word. We still use lots of Celtic words down that way because there's lots of evidence of that, and it's a Celtic part of the world. But they're big rocks on hills that had spiritual significance to the ancient Celts. But that's sort of its own neat part of the world. We see ourselves as a little bit distinct from the rest of England, even though technically we are England, because it's more Celtic. It's sort of similar to Wales or Scotland in a way, in that there's lots more Celtic ancestry than Anglo-Saxon.
What's your spirituality like, the natural spirituality? I know it's Christian, but I wonder if there's a distinct kind of flavor to the Celtic. You get a
lot more Celtic, not necessarily Celtic pagan, I suppose. I've been out on Dartmoor National Park and I've seen people in white robes, like druid types, and that's more common there. But you also get it around Glastonbury and Wiltshire, where I am at the minute, because that's where Lotus Eaters is based. That's where Stonehenge is. And so this part of the world was sort of the centre of the Celtic world. Even in the ancient times, the Celtic druids were trained in the British Isles, and this part of the world was a central part of it, and it's still got that. It's still very distinct even today, even though we've had about 1,500-ish years of Christianity here.
Mm-hmm.
There's still got its holdouts. You still find these old Celtic sites, and it's more common to come across people who might be that way inclined, but it's not common. Most people in Britain are perhaps Christian in name only. They might be baptized and they might put down on their census that they're Christian, but they might not go to church regularly, and they broadly agree with Christianity, but they're not really religious in any sense.
Are you religious in any sense?
Not especially. I've been baptized, but neither of my parents are religious.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have religious family members, particularly on my mum's side, ironically, from the quite Celtic parts, who are actually involved in the church and the like,
Mm-hmm.
and very God-fearing, go to church. Both sets of my grandparents were. So I'm not far off from it, but it's just not very common of people of my age in Britain. It's almost died out. But at the same time, because our Christianity here is not very polarizing, it is basically, the emphasis is put on just being a decent and good human being. It's much more focused about the morality than the divinity. There isn't much hostility to it at the same time as there might be in the United States. And so people are generally favourable towards Christianity, even if they're not very aware of the goings-on. But do you want me to carry on with my ancestry?
Well, I'm just wondering how, like, your ancestry, your cultural identity, coming into critiquing politic. And it seemed like you kind of agreed with me that the de-emphasis of family, king, and God is kind of what's causing a lot of the current cultural turmoil. How you personally feel like you need to shape your life in order to edge or nudge your country and your countrymen in the proper, from your point of view, direction. So I'm wondering if, like, taking religion or family or king more seriously is part of your what you either reluctantly or unreluctantly need to go about doing.
So I think my emphasis is more on family than anything else. I think also being a scientist and knowing the importance of genetics in human behavior and determining how you behave sort of reinforces that. I'm very, it sounds weird to say it like this, sort of very scientific, but I'm very strongly bonded to my family, which sounds silly, but yeah, I've got a good relationship with my family. I care about them very, very deeply, and I want them to be happy and successful. And so that is...
Is it reciprocated? That's a personal question and a joke.
Yes, it is.
Okay, good.
Thankfully.
Good.
I think that's more or less what I live for, is to benefit my family. And I think that there's some degree of spirituality, but I think that not to sound too subversive here or to suggest that I'm against Christianity. I'm not. I've been a big defender of people being able to be Christian and being unmolested by woke stuff in the church and what have you. But I think growing up where I did down in Devon, it's given me something more akin to a more pagan view of things, even though I'm not in any way
religious. What is that? What's the
sense.
Parameters of more of a pagan thing? Is it earthy?
It's. I think I grew up around a lot of nature and a lot of old history. Obviously, in Britain, you can be walking and find something that's thousands of years old. Like one of my big things is going and camping in Dartmoor National Park. There's loads of Bronze Age settlements there. Even evidence of hunter-gatherers many thousands of years ago, 8,000, maybe even 10,000 years ago. Just down the road from where I grew up, they found the oldest evidence of bronze forging in the British Isles. And so it's a very old part of the world, and there's this sort of reverence for one's ancestors when you're living in the skeleton of things that are so old. And I think because I was raised with a great appreciation of history, it's more that than anything. But it feels something akin to a religious experience, this appreciation for one's past. In formalized Celtic religion, it'd be ancestor worship, but obviously I'm not going to be doing that sort of thing, as well as a massive respect for the natural world, and I think because it's being encroached on by housing developments and the like, part of the reason that Tolkien wrote the story as he did in The Lord of the Rings is that he was concerned about industry encroaching on the beautiful countryside, and that's only got worse since he wrote about it. I think he was writing about the Black Country in Birmingham, and there's not only a sense of it's under threat, but some of the nature in Britain is truly gorgeous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you go to these places, and not only do you feel an affinity with your ancestors, but also it's just visually beautiful. And it's all safe. You don't have to, carry any weapons. You can just enjoy the beauty of nature. And these sorts of things give me a profound sense of meaning, I suppose. If I get too fed up of working or too fed up of being in the city, I go out and go camping in the countryside and enjoy being out there. And it's not to say that, I'm living in any way that is antithetical to Christianity necessarily. I'd like to think that, if I reach the pearly gates and they're like, well, you weren't going to church, what's going on? I'd be like, well, I've still behaved according to the tenets of Christianity. I don't steal, I don't lie. I'm kind to my fellow man as much as I can be. I try and do everything right. And my thinking is that I don't fret too much about these things, and as long as I focus on being good, that's sort of all that matters, and hopefully, I'll end up in the right place.
Mm-hmm. There's, there's that Lord of the Rings thing. I grew up on it. My dad read it to us as kids, and then the movies came out. So most people have adopted the cinematic version of it, but there's so much there, of course, and just a wonderful backbone. And I know that Tolkien actually said to some extent that, hoping what it means to people, that it would be a myth for the British Isles, after the fashion of, Homer or Virgil for the Greeks and the Romans, respectively. But one part of the movies that always gets me teared up, like I have this big swell of emotion, is during some sort of battle, one of those little hobbits screams out for the Shire. And his loyalty and his sacrifice for his tiny little country is so electrifying, and the Hobbit as a trope in storytelling really, I think it evokes our childhood. And even our childishness throughout every stage of our life, and that desire to want to express love of one's homeland is so essential. And one thing that has been relentlessly bred out of us, my generation and your generation, since fighting the Nazis, we've denigrated, our elites have denigrated our connection to homeland, and framed any love of one's homeland as the Germanic excessive desire to purify one's homeland. So I just wonder, in your pushing, as you said at the very beginning of our conversation, the bounds of acceptable discourse, how you're reconstruing love of homeland, love of the conservation and adoration, even up to and including ancestor worship. But there's a modern version of it that I detect in you, and you're the British. You guys tend to be very understated, and I wonder to what degree some sort of galvanizing event is going to lead the way to people like standing for English as the English, for British as the British, and if that's necessary, how you're kind of pushing that and making it more acceptable in a time where that's the most unacceptable thing, where it's described as racist to want to preserve your country, your land, and your people.
Well, I think that the British Isles, I don't know whether you spent much time here, but I have. There's no such thing as too much, in my opinion, but it truly is a magical place here, and I've been around a decent amount of the Northern Hemisphere, at least, to many countries, and there are many, many beautiful countries. America, obviously, gorgeous. I'd love to see more of it. I've only seen New England, really. very lucky to have that part of the world. It is beautiful, but I will always have a soft spot in my heart for the magic of the British Isles. It is exactly when I watch those scenes in The Lord of the Rings where they're saying for the Shire. It didn't have to be explained to me. I got it instantly. You live in such a beautiful place. You know, the unspoilt parts of England are magical. They have this feeling about them, this safety, this the place where you want to just set up and live and call your home. This comfortableness, as well as a profound natural beauty, that you're willing to fight for it. And when I try and remoralize myself after I get a little bit too demoralized reading too much news and the like, what I think of is the land itself. I don't even necessarily think about my family. Obviously, they're still incredibly important to me. But I think about my obligation to the land itself because, as I see it, that's what I will be returning to when I die. It's where all of my ancestors are buried. And there's this continuity, this cycle of death and rebirth that I find beautiful. And it's shaped the land that we live in today, so steeped in history. And it's absolutely worth fighting for. And I think that what we're seeing at the minute, to use the sort of analogy to The Lord of the Rings, is that some people are still in denial about Sauron being back and summoning an army, but we're getting to the point where the resistance of man is going to be here. And it's funny we use this as a sort of running theme because as I saw it, I came from nice, quaint, rural Devon where everything's beautiful. It's basically the Shire. There are some parts of it that look almost like the set of it, minus the holes in the ground that people live in. And then I came to Swindon, which is very multicultural, and there's a great big tower in the middle. It feels like I've come to Mordor. And
no, I visited Swindon last February.
It's awful, isn't it?
And I walked around. I was so sad because there were parts of it that were just whoever was imported there didn't care about it. There was these vestiges of the British or the English, I suppose, their cottages, their architecture, very old architecture, and it was inhabited by a people who didn't come from there and just didn't care about it.
Well, it was built in. A lot of it was built in the 19th century because of all of the railway industry. So there's some lovely, beautiful buildings here that are neglected, and it's a shame because, as a people, I think one of the defining traits of the British is that we care about preserving our history more than most others. I think that's why we were the first, really, to adopt archaeology as a widespread discipline and really? Going around and doing it for other people as well. And it is a shame, but I do think as well that, like Frodo at the end of The Lord of the Rings, a lot of us are going to go back to the Shire, and the fight is going to make us feel a little bit like is it really home anymore? But then I feel it a little bit in myself where I'm just like, I've been so, pardon the sort of unintentional pun here, because of course Tolkien being in the trenches was the part of the motivation, wasn't it? I've been in the trenches of politics for so long, I'm not sure I can go back to it and appreciate it like I once did when I was naive of all the goings on. But people will do that, and I think that people are galvanizing. We have something worthwhile fighting for. We're still an intact people for the time being. Like, one thing that really frustrates me is people are like, Britain is finished, it's over, Islam's taken over, but it's only 6.5% of the population.
Yeah, but how fast are they breeding compared to the native population?
Well, one of the charms of having a high number of Pakistanis, other than the fact that they're prone to forming grooming gangs, is that they're also prone to marrying their cousins. And so I think that limits expansion somewhat, when I think it's a third of all birth defects in Britain are from British Pakistani couples. And so
just to push back on that, who's supporting all these birth defects? Who's paying for the medical?
I am, yes.
Yeah.
That's just rubbing salt in the wound there.
Sorry, brother.
You are right. But it means that they're not going to be the best specimens of humanity able to oppress us, I suppose.
Yeah, There was that meme that happened there. I'm adapted to the rapidity of the mimetic world right now, where every month has its own new meme and gathering and dispersing of a crystallization of where we are. But just prior, a series of very powerful memes: Charlie Kirk assassination, Irina, that Ukrainian refugee being murdered in cold.
Something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But prior to that, there was this photo of this feral Scottish girl with an axe and, like, I don't know what the other implement was, like a screwdriver or something.
I think
a knife and an axe, just like shaking at some tourist who apparently wasn't grooming. I don't know, but there was just this kind of this image of Scotland for the Scottish, Britain for the British, England for the English, and then there was that flag protest and stuff, which is ironic.
That's still ongoing.
I guess it's not a protest. It's an expression of solidarity, of identity.
I would call it a movement more than anything, really.
Is it?
In that people are still continuously putting out flags more than ever, really, and it seems to not be burning out in this. I thought when it first started, maybe this is going to go on for a week or two, but no, you see it everywhere now. You travel around England, well, that's mainly where I've been, and you see them in all sorts of unusual places, just driving around, and so it's tantamount to a moralization campaign, I think. But sorry, I interjected.
No, that's the question. How do you interpret that, and then how do you emphasize that so that it has staying power, so that people understand a deeper meaning of what that means? I mean, there's that for the Shire. I think that probably it's for the Shire, but how does that turn into political power? And by political power, I don't mean the leftist or even the liberal view of power is inherently corrupt, but Gondor for the Gondorians, kind of. There is a king, there is a place, there is a people here. How do you cement that?
Mm-hmm. So just to talk briefly about that Scottish girl, because I don't think that was one of the symbols that people tried to turn it into one, but it wasn't the best one, because she sort of she had this air of being a sort of a rough young Scottish girl, and Scottish women are a bit rough around the edges to begin with. Not having a dig. Half my family is Scottish, right?
I know a couple of them. They're pretty brash dames.
But I think that it's just finding an image that sticks. Like, there are sort of rallying cries. Like, I remember there was sort of meta commentary about the squirrel wars. You know about this?
The what?
So that we've got grey squirrels from the United States that carried diseases, and they've killed off a lot of our native red squirrels, which are smaller, cuter, and they've got like these little white bellies and tufty ears. And people are more sympathetic to the red ones because they look cuter, and they're the native ones. And there was some meta commentary basically about the red squirrels are fighting back, and it was used as this rallying cry for a brief time. And so there is these little events that people are using as sort of mimetic warfare of, listen, these red squirrels, we're fighting back, we had the impossible odds, these foreign squirrels have come over here and genocided the
they're eating the swans.
Yeah, that's a sort of more American import, but they are eating the swans as well, like we've seen the video evidence. But these sorts of things, people have a soft heart for animals here.
Yeah.
If there's cruelty to animals, it will galvanise a population. If there's cruelty to children, that caused riots last year, didn't they? And so we've got a lot of sympathy for the meek and things that can't defend themselves, and for our history. And I think that the symbols that will galvanise people will be the ones where it feels like there's a threat to those things. If people start abducting pets in Britain, obviously there was a strong reaction in the United States, but it will cause riots in Britain. I don't know why there's this massive cultural difference. It's not that Americans don't love their pets any more or less than in Britain, but I don't know. It's something that activates us culturally more for whatever reason. I haven't figured it out.
It has to do with, I I think it's encapsulated in a word that you've used to describe your morality: decency. It's almost like it's kind of a relic or a vestige of your chivalric history, which has kind of been degraded and modernized. You guys don't wear armor, you wear suits. You don't fight with swords, you fight economically and maybe with some intelligence, counterintelligence. And that...
Well, you need to see a British street when there's lots of people on a night out. It's not so economic in Britain. Like one of the things that lots of Americans are very surprised that we're happy to punch each other to bits when we're out for a few drinks.
Really?
It's this
you?
Not me specifically. I mean, I've had to defend myself, but I'm never an instigator. But it's more just a combination of having a drinking culture and a national health service that you don't have to pay for. So people are happy to just punch each other. It's a terrible combination.
It's really good that you guys. Yeah, there's still that pugilistic strain. But I think that the love of the animals is kind of like a chivalric. It's decent. That's kind of like the bounds of what is decent. And I think that decency has been weaponized against the British population by the elite construing these immigrants as these kind of wounded animals that we're going to take in and foster. And it turns out that a significant portion of them aren't really housebroken. And I'm sorry to sound racist, but the Pakistani rape gangs is a absolute stain on the British elite, and another evidence not of Sauron and Mordor, but of Saruman and the scourging of the Shire. And that is kind of something that needs to be held up and centered in this as a justification for the pro-English movement.
I think that desecrating of innocence is one of those things that really, really makes us frustrated. I know that we're never going to forget the grooming gangs. It's been in conversation. It gets brought up all of the time in Britain. I don't think the Pakistanis are ever going to be forgiven. They're held collectively responsible, and quite honestly, they deserve it. They are collectively complicit in it, and it's my personal opinion that also things are going to go in a direction where if people find out that you're Pakistani, you're not going to be safe in this country anymore. I think the only thing that's preventing it getting to that point is fear of punishment. But the appetite to get back at these people is definitely there.
Really?
And almost certainly. I think out of all of the ethnicities that are living here, if there was some sort of research done as to who was the most hated, I think they'd be pretty high up, if not number one spot. And that's even with the same phenomenon that you get in the United States, whereby black people are committing the majority of violent crime. I was posting about it today because it was the start of Black History Month when this was recorded. And
how many history months? I thought they had February. They have October now too.
I don't know. I guess it's October. It might be like Mother's and Father's Day, where they're different in Europe and America for whatever reason. Okay. But who knows? I don't care. It's a joke to me anyway. But I was pointing out that they're 13% of the population in London, and I think it was 61% of knife crime off the top of my head and 63% of gun crime, knife murders and gun crime, I think it was. And so it mirrors the FBI statistics for the United States as a whole, which I find very interesting. And even with that massive overrepresentation, I think the ill will isn't as much there for them, because at least they're not like targeting young girls in the same way as the Pakistanis are. Of course, you did have that Rwandan last year, but that made the whole country erupt into violence, more or less.
Yeah.
So
what about the elite suppressing dissent specifically, or covering for the Pakistanis specifically? Is that will gradually eroding or not?
I think that people see it as emblematic of immigration as a whole. If they sort of they've got themselves into a sort of suicide pact where, because it's all intersectional and everything is related, if you get one chink in the armor, then the whole thing goes down. And so they sort of have to defend these Pakistani child rapists. Otherwise, it delegitimizes all of the other things that they're arguing for. And I think people realize that they're not going to win the argument. People aren't willing to compromise on this. I think most discussion behind closed doors is preferred methods of dealing with them in extra legal senses. And so I don't think people are going to be convinced as, oh, you know what, I was wrong. It's not going to happen. People have very much dug their trenches and they're sticking in them. And I think that people aren't going to settle until something very definitive is done about it. I think if they're all deported, that would be the kindest option to them. Not that they deserve it necessarily, but I think that some degree of public trial and public justice needs to be done for this, because it's such a symbolic desecration of innocence and the destruction of literally thousands of young girls' lives.
And their families.
And their families.
Yeah.
So it's entire communities, really. And it's disproportionately in working class areas as well.
Yeah.
And, people who are already hard up, and then you've got the state attacking them for being angry about it. It's the recipe for a powder keg, and I can't blame people for feeling that way. It makes me furious, and the only reason I'm keeping my composure now is that I've talked about it incessantly, in my job, and so I've become familiar with the topic, as dark as that is.
Yeah, it's almost comedic how decent you are while expressing a very deep rage. And you're like, wait, he's expressing a really deep rage, but he's so chill about it. That's
very culturally English, yes.
Yeah.
Very cliche.
Well, what about the circulation of
stoic?
Stoic, yes, proper. What about the circulation of elites? There's got to be there's got to be a 20-year plan. I credit Carl Benjamin, your employer, if I may use that term. I credit him. He got his start, he just wanted to play video games, and then some feminists kind of got on his bad side, and he started a video channel, and he was a part of this whole thing called Gamergate. And a lot of people were involved in that, and his evolution from, I guess, 2014, 2013, whenever he started, to founding the Lotus Eaters, which I perceive as kind of this, you guys meet in person, you guys produce in person in Swindon.
Swindon, yeah.
But it is a virtual prep school. Prep school is probably the wrong word for it, but it's kind of a boarding house of, he's hired a lot of young men, and a lot of young men that kind of go through his business launch into other domains and stuff. So he's really set himself up to influence your generation by not culling, but selecting the best and the brightest, and giving you guys a platform, and then training you, facilitating you guys becoming public, honing your skills, and then going out. And that is what is needed. That's a 20-year plan to circulate the elites. And like Fuentes, who disagree or agree with him, he said explicitly, my job is my desire is to get 10,000 young men to work their butts off and to get into positions of power. And I think that the entire culture war is centered on selecting and molding the next wave of leadership, which will be male. It will be a masculine male. If the West is to be saved, it's going to be saved by young men coming into their own and reclaiming the halls of power. And I don't know if England's going to get a Cromwell, a William, or any number of kings, but I do see that the quickest way to solve your problems is to find a prince and to install a singular, authoritative, purely British, inspiring character there. So I'm wondering if you, what you think about the 20-year plan of saving Britain and what that will take.
Okay, so I suppose I'll touch on the Lotus Eater stuff first and foremost. I think that when I was there when it basically started, Lotus Eaters, I was one of the first people that got hired. And I think Carl was just like, I'm just going to make a podcast and, see where it goes. There's this sort of notion of, we don't know where it's going to go. And then eventually it became a cultural phenomenon, obviously carried on the back of Carl's reputation. Yeah, it was carried on the back of Carl's reputation. I was nobody. I was just a member of the public, and maybe in academia, but other than that, there's nothing that special in Britain. To get a master's degree, plenty of people do it. And I think the charm of it there is that he took people basically from his own audience, because all the people that he's hired watched his stuff. I was watching his stuff for years before I actually worked for him, which made it all the harder, made me all the more worried when I first appeared on camera. And it's like, oh, this is an immense amount of pressure. But I think it gives the idea that anyone can do this. Anyone can speak their mind and go out and alter the zeitgeist, because although people attribute to us as you've moved the Overton window in Britain, I'm always hesitant to say that. I'm always hesitant to take credit for things because I don't know the causality of it necessarily. But we've certainly made people more comfortable with speaking their mind in our audience, I think.
Well, your audience are speaking a certain mind. Yeah.
And I think that by hiring normal people, that's very important and doesn't really get done in the media. That's sort of the novel innovation, in that none of us before we started had any experience doing this really, other than maybe Connor had a little bit of experience before he joined, before he left. And so I think that that's important, because it gives people the impression that, oh yeah, I can do this sort of thing. If normal people are going on and doing these things and, going on to have careers in this sort of area, then maybe I can as well. Maybe I can find a parallel. And I think that the plan needs to be, and I was speaking at the WITAN, I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but it's an event that's organised amongst people in our sphere where lots of people speak, and I actually spoke about how the right can win in Britain. And the very first thing I said is, what we need to do is assemble a government in waiting. And at the minute, the most likely government is going to be Reform, but we've got all the way until 2029, until the next election. I don't think the Labour Party is going to call an early one, which they can do because they're so unpopular. They make no sense. They've already got a majority in Parliament. They've got all the power they need. There's no reason to do it.
Yeah.
And so Reform are going to come in, maybe they're going to do some half measures. They're going to prolong the lifespan at best. That's the best we can hope for. They're not going to go all the way necessarily. Who knows? But I don't necessarily have faith in them. So I feel like what's actually going to happen is the Conservative Party's been somewhat made politically irrelevant. Maybe they're going to go into coalition with Reform so they can have a majority government to pass things. Maybe that will happen. But electorally, they were one of the two major parties. Now they're, doing historically very, very poor. The worst they've done in hundreds of years. And I hope, that carries on into the grave, personally. I think they betrayed our country. They're just as bad, if not worse, than the Labour Party. They're elected to reduce immigration, and they increased it massively and brought some of the worst people here. I think many Conservative politicians should be put on trial for what they did to us. The Labour Party is going the same way. So the two parties that held maybe 80-90% of the vote, if not more, are going the way of the dodo. They're dying. And so Reform's now the favourite. Sort of frees up some space for an even more right-wing party than Reform. Don't know how that's going to go. There are lots of parties that are very small at the minute, don't have any members of Parliament, that's sort of jockeying for that space at the minute. And we'll have to see where that goes. But I think that the direction is going to have to be electorally, which isn't necessarily a barrier. It's not like the United States, where we've got the separation of powers. If you're a prime minister with a majority in Parliament, in theory, as long as all of your members of Parliament obey you, you can do whatever you want. You can change the constitution, whatever. You do whatever's possible to change, you can change. Obviously, you can't do some things, like you can't just say, oh, by the way, we're getting rid of the king, because that would bring about a constitutional crisis.
Well, you could get rid of your Supreme Court, so-called, that is kind of shoehorned in there.
It was another American import, but this time from Tony Blair, which is completely redundant because we have an uncodified constitution. We don't
Yeah.
have it makes our country very flexible.
Yeah.
We do still have some defences, but of course, even with the Constitution in the United States, many of those things have been broken. So I like the idea of having a constitution, but at the end of the day, if it's not enforced, it doesn't matter whether it's codified or not, or codified, I suppose, to America. The importance is having someone in government that's going to follow those principles in the first place. And I'm more concerned with who's going to be in power and for how long. And I think that with the burning of credibility of the current political elites happening so rapidly, Keir Starmer, most unpopular prime minister since money polling has began. So all the way back to Margaret Thatcher and the like.
Yeah.
He's the most unpopular, and he's done this in a record time as well. Many of them took, 8 years. Boris Johnson 4 years. He's done it in a year or so. So,
is there a replacement from the left of the Labour Party? Is there a...
There is the Green Party, which is sort
just
of
stop oil kind of people?
Yeah, they're sort of eco-fundamentalists. They're a bit more socialist than the Labour Party. Yeah, but also they've got a weird Islamist wing about them as well, which is funny. So they're like very LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
Also,
Queers for Palestine.
Yeah, here's Abdul talking about how we're going to spread Islam. Sing it from the rooftops. If you pardon the pun.
Do they have political capital for the native heritage English?
They do well in leftist city areas. They get a few members of parliament, but out of the 650, it's normally like one or two.
Okay.
You get maybe one in Bristol, one in Brighton. Brighton's like the gay capital of Britain, so unsurprising really that they're voting that way. Bristol's like the Portland of Britain, and so you can sort of see that they're only getting the most radicals. They're not really a real political force, and they're sort of a joke. No one really
There's
takes
not
them
a lot
seriously.
of... They're not cool. Yeah, so like young people, aside from the spiteful dysgenics, aren't really gravitating toward them.
Well, I think at the minute they're polling at about 13%, which
Not
is
nothing.
reasonable. But it's sort of the very static radical left percentage that you would normally get anyway.
Yeah. It doesn't seem
think,
that the hard progressives are all that interesting, because they kind of played their whole hand, and we see where it ends up. I love Portland. I spent 10 years of my life there, and it's a travesty that it's become Portland, that you would bring up
part of the world, isn't it?
Yeah, it's gorgeous, and it had such a sweetness, but their weakness of governance and inability to take pride in what they had block them from preserving that, and they very rapidly caught the worst case of Trump derangement syndrome on a mass level, and then they have a woke apocalypse. And so, to bring it back to kind of a rapidly, thank God, aging internet term, woke right. If there was a woke right Portland, the property values would be incredible, the taxes would be very low, and everybody would want to move there. But a woke Portland just is hell on earth. And so the hard progressive wing, we can see that. We can see just how, Chaz and Seattle and California, it's not really interesting, and it's also devastating to everybody involved. So the real interesting energy is on the right, whatever that means. And the right isn't one thing, but I think that is probably what is hopefully attracting serious actors in your generation.
I would say so. And I think also another thing that's putting people off the Green Party is there's a very high profile thing. I can't remember whether it was a councillor, as in like a local councillor, or a member of parliament.
I'm cringing just in expecting what you're going to say. It's probably really cringy. What happened?
Well, he was a Muslim, and what happened is he and his buddies, all bearded men, chanted Allahu Akbar repeatedly upon finding out that he'd won the election, which was a bit of a stark wake-up call, because normally we associate that with a grainy video in the Middle East with an IS flag and maybe a severed head or something, not
Yeah.
our own elections. So I think that it's enough to put off a fair few people. But I think you were going to ask about is basically how are you going to grow the right? Is that where
Yeah,
you're going with
yeah,
this?
yeah. Especially in your generation, like what are, you
Well,
guys are
we don't have to do
optimistic.
very much. It's already going in that direction already.
Okay.
Nigel Farage is the most popular politician, even because he's like the most mainstream right-wing one at the minute. Out of all of our politicians amongst young people, he's approaching sort of Jeremy Clarkson levels of popularity. And you know, if it's like a celebrity that's associated with Top Gear and Clarkson's Farm, I'm not sure if you're familiar with these, but I think they're pretty big shows, aren't they?
Yeah.
But if he's getting to that level of popularity with young people, and it's sort of becoming a bit of a meme to be right wing with young people. Like just the other day, I was walking through Swindon and a bunch of young kids were talking about deporting people and the like, and I was just finding it funny that, wow, times have changed. I mean, obviously in my generation, we were not PC at all, but it's nice to see it come back around again. You know, there were many words we said when I was growing up that will get you fired these days from a job.
You'll get a knock on the door.
That's true, although it seems to be a lot more selective, that sort of thing. Like it does get, obviously it's a massive problem. I don't agree with it,
Yeah.
but the reason I'm cautioning people about this is that I don't want people to be afraid and then comply with what the government wants them to do. There's a very small minority of people that have very limited consequences a lot of the time. You know, it's very rare for it to be anything more than you get dragged through the legal system and then nothing happens, or
Yeah.
you get called to a station for a night and get told off for a little bit, and then you go back home again with no criminal record or what have you. There are some people that do get jailed for social media posts, but normally it's relating to things that are provable, even though in some cases spurious, and I don't agree with it, but it's to do with actual real world violence. Like if you're just saying things that are hurty words, generally speaking, it's not as bad. And I think that that sort of thing's a risk that I'm willing to take, which is why when I'm on Twitter and doing segments for Lotus Eaters and the like, I don't hold my tongue on those things. But I think ultimately the state's worried about a violent uprising. And if you realize that actually that's the only thing they really care about more than anything, just don't be stupid. And you shouldn't be calling for that sort of thing anyway, law or not, because I think there is a democratic and legal way and a dignified way of dealing with these sorts of things. You don't have to resort to those sorts of things. It's not over yet.
So what do you got on your plate? What's coming up? What are you concentrating on? Anything well, like a series or anything kind of more extended or deep?
So I'm sort of spread in lots of different directions at the minute. I left Lotus Eaters as a full-time employee, but I'm still a contributor. You know, they're still all my friends, and you know, I want to go in there and carry on as I would. People are still surprised. It's like, I thought you left. And I was like, no, I said I'd come back. And like, oh, you lied to us. No, everyone's been really nice about it. But I've got my own YouTube channel where I've been doing non-political videos, just things that
About
make
what?
people... all sorts of things. So my first video was about how cities are bad for you psychologically. My most recent one was looking at a parasite that cats carry and how it changes human behavior. Men that are exposed to
Myxomatosis? What's that called?
toxoplasmosis.
Toxoplasmosis.
Myxomatosis is the one that rabbits get, isn't it? But yeah, and it changes your behavior in lots of weird ways. Like it makes you more successful getting infected by this parasite.
Higher risk taking, especially for males, I believe.
Yes, that's right. But even there's a widespread study in Denmark where women were like 20% more likely to set up their own business on their own and things like that, which is 20% difference between being infected or not is huge. And so I was just
The
talking about
untold
little,
ascendancy of the cat woman, cat mom, unsung. I
but
mean.
you don't necessarily have to have a cat to catch it as well. But that's one of the videos. I'm not going to spoil too much of it. I did a long video talking about why wild camping is important. I did one about the AI thought experiment, Rocco's Basilisk, where if you hear the idea of this AI, it could lead to your future torture by this AI if you don't work towards it being created. Sorry, I've just exposed you all to it. You've got to watch the video to find how you get out of it.
Sounds like infinite jest.
I think I've only got one more. I can't remember. What was it?
So, do you have a schedule
Never
for
mind.
these? You try to do a couple.
I just, because they're scripted and edited and,
Yeah.
and everything is done by me, I just make them as I can. I was thinking about doing one about a film maybe next. My favorite film of all time is 2001: A Space Odyssey, and thinking about doing a breakdown of why I think it's the best film ever made, and try just not necessarily to say that all other films are bad, but just like give people a new appreciation for it, because I like my cinema, and I sort of want it to be that channel to be a sort of outlet where it's an escape from politics and it's giving people something nourishing. And if you're still thinking about the video after you've watched it, then I've done something right.
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking about starting a Substack just to do some social commentary sort of observations, almost a bit Hunter S. Thompson-y, if you're familiar with him, sort of bit of gonzo journalism, social observations. I've been writing something about Saint-Tropez in the south of France, which is basically a plaything of the rich. In an old French fishing village, and the juxtaposition of those two things, and also observations about Bristol, which is like a woke capital, and the different kinds of people there, just ripping into them in a sort of comedy way. What else am I doing? I've got a few things I can't talk about with certain organisations. I might potentially be doing some stuff for a new up-and-coming written media publication. I might be involved with an institution that's been set up that's more parliamentary, I suppose. But I can't get into those because I've been asked to be quiet about that. But lots and lots of stuff.
Yeah. And you're on Twitter mouthing off.
Yes. I'm always raising hell, so to speak, on Twitter, making people very upset. People say, British people don't know how to use spices, but I season all of my tweets with them. So
You bring some curry along.
that's our contribution. Yes,
There is
food.
one of the more impactful writers in my young life specifically was William Blake, and he goes into some songs or epics about the spirit of Britain. Albion, I believe he calls her. But there's something very ancient, like primordial there, almost like it's like this little crumb of Pangea that kind of just broke off from the great landmass and carries with it something very, very old, almost Edenic, if you go and walk around it. And I think my ancestry, it goes through Britain, but I think it came up from Normandy, and those old stone monoliths. When I went out and visited there, I felt a connection to a realm of my past that I had never touched before. It was so deep and profound, and I think that there is I don't know why I'm bringing it up, but there's a spirit of Britain that is in the realm of the mythic that needs to be brought up and reignited and reawoken in the English that predates and that will ground. Patriotism's the wrong word. Nationalism's the wrong word. There's something deeper, that for the Shire kind of spirit. And there's this elvish magic there that I just encourage you to pronounce, to give voice to connect people to, because that is something worth not just fighting for, but living for as well. I hear it in your stories. I hear it in your spirit.
Yeah, well, I think that I grew up in a very old part of the world, that's got its history very much on show, and I have a great appreciation for it. And you only need to walk around one of these stone circles, and it's like your blood memories revive. I had the fortune of playing at a carnix recently, which is an old ancient Celtic horn, and just the feeling of it reverberating and finally being able to play one is amazing. Is on my bucket list. One of the things I wanted to do before I die was play that, and it like reawoken an ancestral memory in me that you can't really, unless you've experienced it. It sounds like, what are you on about? What are you talking about? And of all people, funnily enough, I think there is something to this. Of all people, Kurt Cobain, feels weird bringing him up, but there's reportedly a story about him where he went to Ireland before he knew his ancestry, because I think he was adopted. And he said he felt like he was home, and he didn't know why, but he felt a great affinity for the place. And he said, oh yeah, I loved it there, it's wonderful. And then later on he found out that, oh right, I'm actually entirely genetically Irish. And so I think that anecdote, as well as, our sort of personal experiences, suggests that there is something to it, that when you're in the right environment, it reawakens something of your ancestry. And I think that once you recognize this, once you have the eye to see it, it's something you never want to let go of. And I think that magicalness, this sort of old wisdom of the land, is something that we are fighting to preserve, and it's something that I think animates us and makes us go out and do things. We very much appreciate it. We've got a love of our countryside and our environment, more so than many people, and I think that that's because of the nature of it itself. And when you've got such a deeply rooted culture, I could probably trace my ancestry at least 4,500 years back to these islands. That's so many generations. So
yeah,
I couldn't even imagine living somewhere else. I'm going down with a ship. I'm like, the captain of the Titanic. If Britain goes down, so do I, because I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Although if I was forced to, I'd probably move to somewhere like New Hampshire, just because there's no income tax, and it's America, so good living standards.
Yeah.
And the sort of kindred spirits, right? Americans.
Yeah. Part of the Anglosphere, whether we like it or not. Josh, are you
sorry about that.
Are you engaged to be married? You got a steady?
I'm on the right track.
Okay, you're on the right track, because I just wanted to give you an opportunity, because I have a middling platform. Can put out notice that you're available if any British ladies end up tuning in. But it seems like you're kind of you're getting locked in. So
yeah, I think in a couple of months' time I'm going to be moving in with my partner. We've been together approaching 2 years now, so I've got to get permission from her father before I pop the question, but it's probably going to be on the way eventually.
Well, good.
She's watching though. If you do watch this, no, it's not. Wait and see what happens.
You got to get on it, man. You got to change. You got to get on it. Lock it in.
I'm turning 30 this year.
Exactly. You want to be a young father. You don't want to be an old father. So
I'm sure I'll be fine. I'm not too worried. I found the right person. That's the main thing.
Good. Well, I'm really happy for you. And Josh, it's been wonderful talking with you.
And you too.
Thank you very much for coming on. I'll link to your show down there in the description, as well as your Twitter and your other internet droppings. But what is the name of your channel, just to get it in people's ears?
It's just my name, Josh Ferme. So the difficulty is spelling the surname, which comes from Fairholme, believe it or not. It's just somewhat Latinized. Everyone thinks I'm French because it's a French word, but
yeah, it looks French.
I know. I've got no French ancestry as far as I'm aware, at least not from the Scottish side, so I'm safe, all right. I'm not going to lose my passport as an Englishman.
Well, cool. Josh, thank you very much. Been a pleasure. I'll let you know when this is out, and you have a good evening.
You too. Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. There we go.